Good evening. Tonight, we're diving headfirst into one of history's most spectacular hellscapes, being a woman in medieval Europe. And when I say nightmare, I mean the kind of nightmare that makes your worst Monday morning look like a spa day in paradise. Picture this. You wake up at dawn, not to an alarm clock, but to the sound of your husband beating you because you didn't spin enough wool yesterday. Your breakfast: moldy bread and ale that tastes like someone's armpit. Your skincare routine: well, let's just say medieval women had a skincare regimen that would make a horror movie director weep with joy. And we're talking about deliberately applying lead-based makeup that slowly poisoned them to death. But hey, at least they looked pale and fashionable while dying, right? Before we descend into this medieval madness together, tell us in the comments what country you're watching from and what time it is right now. We want to see how global this medieval misery goes. Are you watching this at 3 a.m., questioning your life choices? Are you in Tokyo wondering why you clicked on this historical horror show? Drop those locations and times. Let's see if anyone's brave enough to watch this nightmare fuel during daylight hours. Now, let's talk about what it really meant to be a woman in medieval times. And trust me, after this video, you'll never complain about modern dating apps again. Because imagine if instead of swiping left on creepy guys, your father could literally sell you to the highest bidder when you turned 12. And I'm not being dramatic. That was Tuesday for most medieval girls. The moment you popped out of the womb as a female in medieval Europe, you were already at a disadvantage that would make modern inequality look like a minor inconvenience. Your very existence was considered a cosmic mistake by the church, which taught that women were literally created from Adam's rib as an afterthought, a divine consolation prize for man's loneliness. The church fathers, those cheerful fellows, proclaimed that women were the gateway to hell, the root of all evil, and basically walking vaginas designed to tempt men into sin and damnation. Saint Jerome, who clearly had some issues with the ladies, wrote that women were the devil's doorway, and that marriage was only slightly better than burning in hell for eternity. What a charmer. Saint Augustine, not to be outdone in the misogyny department, declared that women were naturally inferior to men and existed solely for reproductive purposes. He argued that if God had wanted Adam to have a companion for intelligent conversation, he would have created another man. Women, according to Augustine, were useful only for making babies and should otherwise keep their mouths shut. Thomas Aquinas, the medieval church's golden boy of theology, took this even further by arguing that women were defective males, who only existed because of some cosmic accident during conception. He literally wrote that women were mistakes of nature, incomplete beings who were unfortunately necessary for the continuation of the species. But the real kicker: medieval society was so convinced that women were inferior that they developed an entire medical theory around it. According to medieval physicians, who were about as qualified as your average TikTok influencer giving medical advice, women were basically defective men. They believed that women were men who didn't develop properly in the womb because they lacked sufficient heat. Yes, you heard that right. Women were considered to be literally failed men, like cosmic manufacturing defects. These same brilliant minds thought that women's wombs could wander around their bodies like lost tourists, causing hysteria and madness. The cure: marriage and pregnancy, of course, to keep that rogue uterus properly anchored. Medieval medical texts, written exclusively by men who had never bothered to actually study female anatomy, contained some truly spectacular theories about women's bodies. They believed that women had fewer teeth than men because they were clearly inferior beings. They thought that women's brains were smaller and wetter than men's, making them naturally prone to emotional instability and poor decision-making. Some physicians claimed that women's blood was different from men's blood, colder and more corrupt, which explained why women were naturally weaker and more sinful. The medieval understanding of conception was equally ridiculous and heavily biased against women. They believed that men provided the seed which contained the entire future human being, while women were merely empty vessels that provided nourishment, like human incubators. If a baby was born healthy and intelligent, it was obviously due to the father's superior seed. If a baby was sickly or deformed, well, that was clearly the mother's fault for having an inadequate womb or for having sinful thoughts during pregnancy. Women were literally blamed for everything that went wrong with their children, while receiving no credit for anything that went right. Speaking of marriage, let's dive into medieval romance, which was about as romantic as a root canal performed by a drunk barber. If you were born female, your romantic destiny was decided before you could even say mama. Marriage wasn't about love, compatibility, or even basic human decency. It was a business transaction that would make modern corporate mergers look warm and fuzzy. Your father essentially owned you like a prize heifer until he could transfer ownership to your husband in exchange for land, money, or political alliances. The marriage negotiations were conducted entirely between the men in your life, as if you were a particularly valuable piece of livestock. Your father would meet with potential suitors or their representatives to discuss your dowry, which was essentially the price your family had to pay to get rid of you. The size of your dowry determined the quality of husband you could attract. A large dowry might get you a decent nobleman, while a small dowry meant you'd be stuck with whatever desperate or defective male was willing to take you. No dowry at all. Congratulations, you were headed for a life of poverty, prostitution, or the convent. The age of consent. Well, that's where things get really dark. Girls as young as 7 could be betrothed, and marriage was legal at 12. 12. When modern girls are worried about middle school drama and what to wear to the school dance. Medieval girls were being handed over to grown men who were often decades older. The church, in its infinite wisdom, declared that once a girl reached puberty, she was ready for marriage and childbearing. Because nothing says God's plan like a 12-year-old being expected to manage a household and produce heirs. These child brides had no say in their marriages whatsoever. Your husband could be a decrepit old man with rotting teeth and a violent temper, or he could be a young knight who seemed charming until you discovered his hobby of collecting the ears of his enemies. It didn't matter, you were going to marry him anyway, and you were going to smile about it, or face the consequences. And what were those consequences? Well, refusing to marry could result in being disowned by your family, locked in a convent, or, in extreme cases, beaten until you agreed to comply. The wedding ceremony itself was often the first time a bride met her husband, and it was designed to emphasize her complete submission to male authority. The bride was literally given away by her father to her husband, like a piece of property changing hands. She had to promise to love, honor, and obey her husband, while he only had to promise to provide for her. The symbolism was clear. She was surrendering her identity and autonomy to become an extension of her husband's will. Medieval wedding nights were traumatic experiences that would be classified as rape by modern standards. Young girls who had received no education about sex were expected to submit to grown men who saw them as sexual property. There was no concept of consent or consideration for the bride's feelings or physical readiness. The marriage was considered consummated when the husband had penetrated his wife. regardless of her age, willingness, or physical condition. Wedding guests would sometimes wait outside the bedroom to hear evidence that the marriage had been consummated, adding public humiliation to private trauma. Once you were married, your legal status changed from property of father to property of husband, which wasn't exactly an upgrade. Under medieval law, married women had roughly the same legal rights as children and livestock. Your husband could beat you, rape you, and control every aspect of your life, and it was all perfectly legal. In fact, the church encouraged husbands to discipline their wives, providing helpful guidelines on how to beat your spouse properly. The rule of thumb literally stated that a man could beat his wife with a stick as long as it wasn't thicker than his thumb. How considerate. But wait, it gets worse. Your husband could also sell your property, make legal decisions on your behalf, and even testify against you in court, while you had no such rights in return. If your husband committed a crime, you could be held legally responsible as his property. If he died, you didn't automatically inherit his wealth that went to his male relatives, leaving you potentially destitute and dependent on the charity of people who might not give a damn about your survival. The concept of marital rape didn't exist in medieval law because wives were expected to be sexually available to their husbands at all times. A husband could force himself on his wife regardless of her health, emotional state, or personal desires, and she had no legal recourse. Women who resisted their husband's sexual advances could be beaten, locked up, or divorced for failing in their wifely duties. The church taught that wives had a religious obligation to submit to their husband's sexual demands, making resistance not just legally impossible, but morally sinful. Medieval marriage contracts sometimes included specific provisions about the wife's sexual availability, treating her body like a commodity to be regulated by legal agreement. Some contracts specified how many times per week a wife was expected to have sex with her husband, as if intimacy were a chore to be scheduled like household tasks. Women who became pregnant were often expected to continue sexual relations with their husbands throughout pregnancy, despite the obvious health risks to both mother and child. Now, let's talk about the daily reality of medieval women's lives, which was like playing life on nightmare difficulty mode with all the cheat codes working against you. Your day began before dawn, because sleep was apparently a luxury reserved for the dead. You'd wake up in a house that was basically a wooden box filled with smoke, animal feces, and the lingering smell of unwashed humanity. Central heating. That's a cute modern concept. Medieval homes were so cold that people regularly shared beds with their livestock for warmth, which explains why medieval medicine was constantly dealing with mysterious illnesses that definitely weren't mysterious if you understood basic hygiene. The typical medieval peasant home was a single room that housed the entire family plus their animals. Privacy was non-existent. Families of 10 or more people lived, ate, slept, and performed bodily functions in the same cramped space. Windows were rare and usually just holes in the wall covered with animal skin or oiled cloth, providing minimal light and no protection from the elements. The floor was usually dirt covered with rushes that were changed infrequently, creating a breeding ground for fleas, lice, and rodents. Your breakfast, if you were lucky enough to have one, consisted of whatever hadn't rotted or been eaten by vermin overnight. Bread was the staple food, but medieval bread was nothing like the fluffy white loaves we know today. It was often made with sawdust, ground bones, and whatever random grains were available, creating a substance that had the texture of cardboard and the nutritional value of dirt. The wealthy ate white bread, while the poor got dark bread that was sometimes so hard it could be used as a weapon. Women were expected to bake this bread themselves, using ovens that were basically stone caves that had a 50-50 chance of either baking your bread or burning down your entire village. The process of making bread was back-breaking labor that consumed entire days. Women had to grind grain by hand using heavy stone querns, a process that was so strenuous it often left them with permanent back injuries and deformed hands. The grain was frequently contaminated with ergot, a fungus that caused hallucinations, convulsions, and sometimes death. But hey, at least dinner was trippy. Water was too dangerous to drink because medieval people hadn't quite figured out that dumping sewage in the same rivers they drank from might be problematic. So instead, everyone drank ale, including children. Yes, medieval toddlers were basically functioning alcoholics by modern standards, which might explain why medieval people made so many questionable life choices. Women were responsible for brewing this ale, adding beer making to their already impossible list of daily responsibilities. Brewing ale was a complex process that required skill, timing, and expensive ingredients. Women had to malt barley, boil massive quantities of water, monitor fermentation, and store the finished product properly. The ale had to be consumed quickly because it had no preservatives and would spoil within days. A family's survival often depended on a woman's brewing skills, because bad ale could mean dehydration and death for the entire household. Personal hygiene was optional at best and completely absent at worst. Bathing was considered dangerous by medieval physicians, who believed that water opened the pores and let in disease. Instead, people changed their linen undergarments occasionally and called it good. Women were expected to maintain their appearance, despite having access to washing facilities roughly as often as Halley's Comet appeared. They used urine as a teeth whitener, lead-based cosmetics that slowly poisoned them, and perfumes made from animal musk to cover the smell of their unwashed bodies. Medieval dental care was particularly horrifying. Tooth decay was universal, and the methods for dealing with it were more dangerous than the problem itself. Barber surgeons, who were basically medieval multitaskers who cut hair, performed surgery and pulled teeth with the same unwashed tools, were the closest thing to dentists available. Tooth extraction was performed without anesthesia using crude pliers, often resulting in broken jaws, massive infections, and death from blood loss. Many women lost all their teeth by age 30, leaving them unable to eat solid food and prematurely aged. The fashion choices available to medieval women were designed by people who clearly hated women. The wealthy wore layers upon layers of heavy fabrics that weighed as much as a small car and required teams of servants to put on and take off. These dresses were so restrictive that women couldn't bend, sit comfortably, or move freely, which was probably the point. The poor wore simple tunics that offered no protection from the elements and fell apart after a few months of wear. Everyone wore head coverings because showing your hair was considered sexually provocative, which meant that medieval women walked around looking like colorful tents with faces. Medieval fashion was literally designed to incapacitate women and emphasize their helplessness. The wealthy wore corsets made of whalebone or metal that compressed their internal organs and made breathing difficult. Their sleeves were so long and trailing that they couldn't use their hands effectively. Their skirts were so voluminous that they needed assistance to walk through doorways. The message was clear. A properly dressed woman was a woman who couldn't function independently. The process of getting dressed was an ordeal that could take hours and required multiple assistants. Wealthy women wore so many layers, chemise, Corsets, underskirts, overskirts, bodices, sleeves, and various accessories that they were essentially wearing architectural structures rather than clothing. The weight of these garments often caused fainting, back problems, and difficulty breathing. Women who wore the most elaborate fashions were essentially prisoners of their own wardrobes. But here's where it gets really fun. Medieval women were expected to work like pack mules while maintaining the grace and dignity of noblewomen. If you were a peasant woman, your job description included farming, animal husbandry, food preparation, textile production, childcare, house cleaning, and whatever other back-breaking labor your husband decided to assign you. You were basically a one-woman industrial revolution, expected to produce everything your family needed to survive, using only your bare hands and whatever primitive tools you could cobble together. Agricultural work was particularly brutal for women. They were expected to work in the fields from dawn to dusk during planting and harvest seasons, often while pregnant or nursing infants. Women did the back-breaking work of weeding, harvesting, and threshing grain by hand. They were responsible for tending vegetable gardens, managing dairy operations, and raising poultry. During harvest time, women worked 18-hour days in all weather conditions, often collapsing from exhaustion in the fields. Medieval farming tools were heavy and poorly designed, making agricultural work even more difficult for women who were typically smaller and weaker than men. Plows were so heavy that they required teams of oxen to pull them, and women often had to guide these massive implements while heavily pregnant. Scythes and sickles were sharp and dangerous, leading to frequent injuries and infections. Women who were injured during farming work rarely received medical care and were expected to continue working despite their injuries. Textile production was another full-time job that fell primarily to women. They had to raise sheep, shear them, clean and prepare the wool, spin it into thread, weave it into cloth, and then sew it into clothing for their families. This process was so time-consuming that a single garment might take months to complete. Women were judged harshly if their families weren't properly clothed, but they were given no additional time or resources to accomplish this impossible task. The spinning wheel, which didn't appear until the late medieval period, was a revolutionary invention that still required hours of tedious labor. Before its invention, women spun thread using drop spindles while walking or doing other tasks, a process that was incredibly slow and physically demanding. Women were expected to spin thread during every spare moment, and the phrase spinster, meaning an unmarried woman, reflects how central spinning was to female identity. Wealthy women had it slightly better in that they didn't have to break their backs in the fields, but they were instead expected to manage enormous households that functioned like small corporations. A noblewoman might oversee dozens of servants, manage the family's finances, coordinate massive feasts, and maintain diplomatic relationships with other noble families. Oh, and she was also expected to produce male heirs, while looking beautiful and remaining perfectly obedient to her husband. No pressure. Managing a medieval noble household was like running a small city. Noble women had to coordinate the activities of dozens of servants, each with specialized roles and hierarchies. They had to manage food supplies for hundreds of people, ensure that the castle was properly maintained and defended, and handle the complex logistics of medieval hospitality. When important guests arrived, noble women were responsible for providing entertainment, accommodation, and elaborate feasts that could bankrupt the family if mismanaged. The pressure to produce male heirs was overwhelming for noble women. Their entire value was tied to their ability to give birth to sons who could inherit their father's titles and properties. Women who produced only daughters were considered failures, regardless of their skills in household management or their personal qualities. The pressure was so intense that some noble women risked their lives with dangerous pregnancy remedies or submitted to bizarre fertility treatments recommended by medieval physicians. Medieval medicine was particularly brutal for women because it was based on the assumption that women were fundamentally flawed and mysterious creatures, whose bodies operated according to principles that defied logic. Menstruation was considered a curse from God, a monthly reminder that women were unclean and sinful. During their periods, women were banned from churches, forbidden from touching food, and generally treated like walking biological hazards. Some medieval texts claim that menstruating women could kill plants by looking at them and turn wine into vinegar with their breath. The fact that roughly half the population menstruated monthly apparently didn't clue anyone in to the idea that maybe this was a normal biological function rather than a supernatural curse. Medieval attitudes toward menstruation were so extreme that they bordered on psychotic. Women were forbidden from participating in religious ceremonies during their periods because they were considered spiritually contaminated. They couldn't prepare food because their touch was believed to spoil it. They were banned from dairy work because their presence would supposedly cause milk to sour and butter to fail. Some medieval authorities claimed that menstruating women's breath could tarnish mirrors and their gaze could poison animals. The medical treatments for menstrual problems were horrifying and often deadly. Medieval physicians recommended bloodletting, purging, and various herbal concoctions that were more likely to kill patients than cure them. Women who experienced painful periods were told that their suffering was divine punishment for Eve's sin, and that seeking relief was spiritually dangerous. Some physicians recommended binding women's breasts and genitals with tight bandages to control their reproductive functions. Pregnancy and childbirth were basically death sentences that women were expected to accept with grace and gratitude. Medieval obstetrics was performed by people who had no understanding of anatomy, sterilization, or basic medical principles. Women gave birth, attended by midwives who meant well but were working with medical knowledge that was roughly equivalent to witchcraft. The maternal mortality rate was so high that many women wrote their wills when they discovered they were pregnant, because they knew there was a decent chance they wouldn't survive the experience. Medieval midwifery was based on superstition, folk wisdom, and sheer desperation rather than medical knowledge. Midwives had no understanding of infection control, proper positioning, or how to handle complications during delivery. They used unwashed hands and contaminated instruments, spreading disease from one patient to another. Their treatments for difficult births included bizarre rituals like placing relics on the woman's belly, making her drink various potions, or having her recite specific prayers. The church taught that the pain of childbirth was God's punishment for Eve's sin in the Garden of Eden, so pain relief was not only unavailable but considered sinful. Women were expected to suffer through labor without complaint as penance for their inherent wickedness. If a woman died in childbirth, it was considered evidence of her spiritual failings. If she survived but the baby died, she was often blamed for insufficient faith or moral shortcomings. And if both mother and baby survived, well, that was obviously God's mercy despite the woman's unworthiness. Medieval birthing practices were designed to maximize suffering rather than promote health. Women were forced to give birth in upright positions that made delivery more difficult and dangerous. They were forbidden from crying out during labor because it was considered evidence of insufficient faith. Many were denied food and water during extended labors, weakening them further. The birthing chamber was often crowded with female relatives, who offered conflicting advice and created a chaotic, stressful environment. Multiple pregnancies were the norm because contraception was both unavailable and forbidden by the church. Women had babies until their bodies literally couldn't handle it anymore, often dying young from exhaustion and repeated pregnancies. Those who survived often had so many children that they couldn't possibly care for them all adequately, leading to high infant mortality rates that made medieval life a constant cycle of pregnancy, birth, and grief. The Church's prohibition on contraception meant that women had no control over the timing or frequency of their pregnancies. Even methods like withdrawal or barrier methods were considered sinful because they interfered with God's will. Women who tried to prevent pregnancy risked being accused of witchcraft or heresy. The result was that most women spent their entire adult lives either pregnant, nursing, or recovering from childbirth. Medieval understanding of fertility was so primitive that many believed pregnancy could occur through supernatural means. Some thought that women could become pregnant by bathing in water where men had bathed, or by exposure to male semen through indirect contact. These bizarre beliefs led to even more restrictions on women's behavior and further limitations on their freedom of movement. But let's talk about what happened when women stepped out of line, because medieval society had some truly creative ways of punishing women who dared to challenge the established order. If you were accused of being a scold, which basically meant you had opinions and weren't afraid to express them, you could be sentenced to wear a scold's bridle, a metal cage that fitted over your head with a metal piece that went into your mouth to prevent you from speaking. You'd be paraded through town like a zoo animal while people mocked and humiliated you, because nothing says Christian charity like public humiliation of women who dared to speak their minds. The scold's bridle was a device of torture, designed specifically for women who were considered too outspoken or rebellious. The metal framework enclosed the entire head with a flat piece of iron that was forced into the mouth to press down the tongue. Some versions had spikes that would pierce the tongue if the woman tried to speak. The device was locked onto the woman's head, and she was forced to wear it in public for hours or days, unable to eat, drink, or speak while being subjected to public ridicule and abuse. Other punishments for difficult women included the ducking stool, where women were strapped to a chair and repeatedly dunked in filthy water until they nearly drowned. The pillory, where women were locked in wooden stocks in the town square and pelted with rotten food, stones, and human waste. The cucking stool, where women were paraded through town on a special chair designed to humiliate them. These punishments were specifically designed for women and reflected society's particular hatred of females who refused to be silent and submissive. Adultery was punishable by death for women, but often overlooked for men, because medieval logic was about as consistent as a drunk person's reasoning. A woman could be stoned, burned, or buried alive for sleeping with someone other than her husband, while her male partner might face a fine or brief imprisonment. The double standard was so extreme that some medieval legal codes allowed husbands to murder their wives if they caught them in adultery. But wives had no such recourse if their husbands cheated. The punishments for female adultery were specifically designed to be as painful and humiliating as possible. Women might be stripped naked and forced to walk through town while being whipped. They could be branded with hot irons to mark them permanently as adulteresses. Some were forced to wear distinctive clothing or symbols that identified them as unfaithful wives. The goal was not just punishment, but but permanent social destruction. A woman who survived being punished for adultery would be ostracized for the rest of her life. Meanwhile, men who committed adultery faced minimal consequences and could often buy their way out of punishment with fines or donations to the church. The hypocrisy was so blatant that some medieval legal texts actually acknowledged the double standard while continuing to enforce it. Male sexuality was seen as natural and uncontrollable, while female sexuality was viewed as dangerous and in need of constant regulation. The witch trials, which peaked in the later medieval period and continued into the early modern era, were perhaps the most terrifying example of medieval misogyny in action. Being accused of witchcraft was basically a death sentence that could be triggered by anything from having a successful herb garden to being too attractive or too ugly. Women who were too independent, too outspoken, too successful, or too different were prime targets for accusations. The tests for witchcraft were designed to be unwinnable. If you floated when thrown into water, you were a witch and would be burned. If you sank and drowned, congratulations, you were innocent. The torture used to extract confessions was so extreme that people would admit to anything to make it stop, leading to a cycle of accusations and executions that decimated entire communities, which accusations were often triggered by the most mundane activities. Women who were skilled at herbal medicine were suspected of using supernatural powers. Women who owned cats were accused of having familiars. Women who lived alone were considered unnatural and threatening. Widows who managed to maintain their independence were prime targets. Even women who were too successful at traditionally female tasks like brewing or midwifery could be accused of using witchcraft to gain an unfair advantage. The torture methods used to extract confessions from accused witches were specifically designed to target women's bodies and sexuality. Women had their breasts crushed, their genitals mutilated, and their bodies subjected to sexual violence disguised as investigation. They were stripped naked and examined for devil's marks. Basically, any mole, birthmark, or scar could be interpreted as evidence of supernatural evil. The humiliation was as much a part of the punishment as the physical torture. The economic motives behind which accusations were often transparent. Accused women's property could be confiscated by the authorities, providing a financial incentive. For persecution, women who inherited wealth or land were particularly vulnerable because their success threatened the social order. Eliminating them through witch trials was a convenient way to redistribute their assets to men while reinforcing male dominance. Even women's relationship with religion, which was supposed to provide comfort and meaning, was complicated by the church's fundamental misogyny. Women were considered spiritually inferior to men and were banned from most religious roles. They couldn't become priests, bishops, or hold any position of authority within the church hierarchy. The Virgin Mary was held up as the ideal woman, a virgin mother who was completely submissive and obedient, setting an impossible standard that real women could never achieve. Medieval Christianity taught that women were inherently more sinful than men because of Eve's role in the fall from grace. Women were seen as more susceptible to temptation and less capable of spiritual growth. They were required to cover their heads in church because their hair was considered sexually distracting to men. They were forbidden from speaking in religious services and were expected to learn about faith only through male intermediaries. The cult of the Virgin Mary, while ostensibly honoring a female figure, actually reinforced impossible expectations for women. Mary was praised for being both a virgin and a mother, a biological impossibility that real women could never achieve. She was celebrated for her complete submission to God's will, providing a model of feminine obedience that was used to justify women's subordination. Mary's suffering was glorified as the proper response to female pain, teaching women that they should accept their misery without complaint. Convents offered one of the few alternatives to marriage, but even there, women faced restrictions and limitations. Nuns were expected to be completely obedient to male church authorities, and many convents were essentially prisons for women, whose families wanted to get rid of them. Some women chose the religious life as a way to gain education and independence, but they paid for it with complete renunciation of any personal autonomy or worldly pleasures. Life in medieval convents was harsh and often brutal. Nuns were expected to maintain strict silence for most of the day, speak only when necessary, and spend hours in prayer and manual labor. They were frequently underfed, inadequately housed, and subjected to physical punishments for minor infractions. Many convents were poorly funded and operated more like workhouses than spiritual communities. The economic reality for women was equally grim. Most women had no independent income and no way to support themselves if their husbands died or abandoned them. Widows were particularly vulnerable, often forced to remarry quickly or face destitution. The few jobs available to women, like brewing, textile work, or midwifery, were poorly paid and offered no security. Women who tried to enter male-dominated trades faced hostility, discrimination, and often violence from male workers who saw them as threats to their livelihoods. Medieval guilds, which controlled most skilled trades, systematically excluded women from membership and training. Women were forbidden from learning valuable skills like metalworking, stone carving, or advanced textile production. They were relegated to unskilled labor that paid a fraction of what men earned for similar work. Even in trades that were traditionally dominated by women, like brewing or baking, men gradually took over as these industries became more profitable. The few women who managed to establish successful businesses were constantly harassed by male competitors and government authorities. They faced discriminatory taxes, licensing restrictions, and legal challenges that male business owners never encountered. Their success was often attributed to sexual favors or supernatural assistance, rather than skill or hard work. Education was largely denied to women, with most remaining illiterate throughout their lives. The few women who did learn to read and write were usually from wealthy families and were taught only enough to manage household accounts or read religious texts. The idea that women might benefit from the same education as men was considered not just unnecessary, but dangerous. Educated women were seen as threats to the natural order. The medieval university system was completely closed to women. Universities were essentially male clubs where men could pursue advanced studies in theology, law, medicine, and philosophy, while women were excluded entirely. The few women who managed to acquire advanced learning did so through private tutoring or religious instruction, and they were often viewed with suspicion and hostility. The prohibition on female education was justified by claims that women's brains were too small or too differently structured to handle complex learning. Medieval authorities argued that educating women would make them rebellious, sexually promiscuous, and unfit for their domestic duties. They claimed that too much learning could actually damage women's reproductive capacity and make them unable to bear children. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of medieval women's lives was how thoroughly they were conditioned to accept their own oppression. From birth, girls were taught that their suffering was natural, divinely ordained, and ultimately their own fault. They were told that their pain was punishment for Eve's sin, that their subordination was God's will, and that their only hope for salvation lay in complete submission to male authority. The psychological manipulation was so complete that many women internalized these beliefs and actively participated in enforcing them on other women. Medieval child-rearing practices for girls were designed to break their spirits and create compliant, submissive adults. Girls were taught from infancy that they were inferior to boys and that their purpose in life was to serve male needs. They were given fewer resources, less attention, and harsher punishments than their brothers. They were trained to be quiet, obedient, and self-sacrificing from the earliest age. The rare women who managed to achieve some measure of independence or success were often seen as anomalies or threats to be eliminated. Female rulers like Eleanor of Aquitaine or Matilda of England faced constant challenges to their authority that their male counterparts never experienced. Female scholars, artists, or entrepreneurs were viewed with suspicion and often accused of achieving their success through supernatural or sexual means rather than talent or hard work. Women who displayed intelligence, ambition, or independence were labeled as unnatural and dangerous. They were accused of being witches, prostitutes, or possessed by demons. The message was clear. Women who refused to accept their assigned role were not just breaking social rules, but defying the natural order of the universe, even in death. Women faced discrimination. Suicide was considered a sin, but women who killed themselves to escape abusive marriages or impossible situations were often given harsher posthumous punishments than men who committed suicide for other reasons. Women who died in childbirth were sometimes buried in unconsecrated ground if they hadn't received last rites, condemned to spiritual limbo for the crime of dying while performing their expected biological function. Medieval funeral practices often reflected the devaluation of women's lives. Women's funerals were typically less elaborate than men's, with fewer prayers, less expensive ceremonies, and smaller gatherings of mourners. Women who died young were often memorialized primarily for their beauty or their potential as mothers, rather than for any personal accomplishments or individual qualities. The legal system was stacked against women in every possible way. Women could rarely testify in court, couldn't enter into contracts, and had no recourse against domestic violence or sexual assault. A woman's word was worth less than a man's in legal proceedings, and female victims of crimes were often blamed for their own victimization. The concept of consent was essentially non-existent. Women were expected to submit to sexual advances from their husbands and had no legal protection against rape within marriage. Medieval courts operated under the assumption that women were natural liars who couldn't be trusted to tell the truth. Women's testimony was considered unreliable because they were supposedly more emotional and less rational than men. In cases involving sexual assault, women were required to provide physical evidence of their resistance, and failure to show adequate injuries was taken as proof that they had consented to the assault. The punishment for crimes was often different for women than for men, and usually harsher. Women who committed murder faced execution by burning, while men were typically hanged or beheaded, methods that were considered more merciful. Women who committed theft were often subjected to more severe penalties than men who stole similar items. The reasoning was that women's crimes were considered more heinous because they went against their supposedly gentle nature. Medieval women's relationship with their own bodies was complicated by religious and medical teachings that portrayed female anatomy as mysterious, dangerous, and fundamentally flawed. Women were taught to be ashamed of their bodies, to see menstruation as a curse, and to view pregnancy and childbirth as necessary evils rather than natural processes. The lack of understanding about female anatomy meant that women's health concerns were often dismissed or attributed to moral failings rather than medical conditions. Medieval medical texts contained wildly inaccurate information about women's bodies that would be laughable if it weren't so tragic. Physicians believed that women's wombs could literally wander around their bodies like lost pets, causing all sorts of health problems. They thought that women who didn't have regular sex would suffer from womb fury, a condition that could supposedly be cured only by marriage or manual stimulation by a physician. Yes, medieval doctors were literally prescribing orgasms as medical treatment, but only for married women or under strict medical supervision. The medieval understanding of female sexuality was particularly twisted. Women were simultaneously seen as sexually insatiable and as pure vessels who should have no sexual desires at all. The Church taught that women were naturally lustful and prone to sexual sin, while also expecting them to remain chaste and pure. This impossible contradiction meant that women could never win. They were condemned for having sexual desires, but also condemned for lacking them. Female masturbation was considered one of the most serious sins a woman could commit, punishable by years of penance or even excommunication. Women who were caught engaging in self-pleasure could be subjected to exorcism, physical punishment, or forced into religious life. The reasoning was that female sexual pleasure that didn't serve reproductive purposes was an abomination that threatened the natural order. Medieval contraceptive methods, when they existed at all, were dangerous and ineffective. Women used everything from crocodile dung to mercury-based potions in desperate attempts to prevent pregnancy. These remedies were more likely to cause poisoning, infection, or death than to prevent conception. Some women resorted to infanticide, or abandonment of unwanted children, acts that were punishable by death but sometimes seemed preferable to bringing another child into a world of poverty and suffering. The social isolation experienced by many medieval women was profound. Married women were often cut off from their birth families and expected to find their entire identity within their husband's household. Friendships between women were sometimes viewed with suspicion, and women who spent too much time together might be accused of plotting against their husbands or engaging in inappropriate behavior. The absence of social support networks made women even more vulnerable to abuse and exploitation. Medieval women were expected to find all their emotional fulfillment through their relationships with men and children. Female friendships were seen as potentially dangerous because they might provide women with emotional support that could make them less dependent on male approval. Women who formed close bonds with other women were sometimes accused of engaging in unnatural relationships or of conspiring against male authority. The concept of privacy was virtually non-existent for medieval women. They were constantly under surveillance by family members, neighbors, and community leaders who monitored their behavior for signs of impropriety. Women who spent time alone were viewed with suspicion because solitude was seen as an opportunity for sinful thoughts or activities. Even within their own homes, women had little privacy because medieval houses were small and crowded. Medieval women's clothing was designed to restrict their movement and emphasize their vulnerability. The long trailing sleeves, popular among wealthy women, made it impossible to work with their hands effectively. The elaborate headdresses worn by married women were so heavy and awkward that they caused neck problems and headaches. The tight-fitting bodices restricted breathing and movement. Every aspect of female fashion was designed to demonstrate that women were decorative objects rather than functional human beings. The beauty standards imposed on medieval women were both impossible to achieve and dangerous to pursue. Pale skin was considered the height of beauty, leading women to use lead-based cosmetics that slowly poisoned them. They plucked their hairlines to create artificially high foreheads, often causing permanent hair loss and infections. They used belladonna drops to dilate their pupils, causing vision problems and sometimes blindness. The pursuit of beauty literally killed medieval women. But they continued these practices because their value was tied entirely to their appearance. Medieval women's work was systematically devalued, even when it was essential for survival. Women's labor in food production, textile manufacture, and childcare was considered natural rather than skilled, which justified paying them less or not paying them at all. Women who worked outside the home were viewed with suspicion and faced constant harassment from male workers who resented their presence in the workforce. The seasonal nature of medieval agriculture meant that women's workload varied dramatically. Throughout the year, during harvest time, women worked 18-hour days in back-breaking labor, often while pregnant or nursing infants. During winter months, they focused on textile production and food preservation, working by candlelight in cold, poorly ventilated spaces. There was no such thing as vacation time or sick leave for medieval women. They worked until they literally couldn't continue. Medieval women who showed any sign of mental illness or emotional distress were often accused of being possessed by demons or cursed by God. Depression, anxiety, and trauma responses were interpreted as spiritual failings rather than medical conditions. The treatments for mental illness were often worse than the original condition. Exorcism, physical restraint, starvation, and various forms of torture. Disguised as medical intervention, women who experienced what we would now recognize as postpartum depression were particularly vulnerable to accusations of witchcraft or demonic possession. Their inability to bond with their children or their expressions of despair were seen as evidence of supernatural evil rather than normal responses to trauma and hormonal changes. Many women were executed or imprisoned for displaying symptoms that we now understand as treatable medical conditions. The medieval understanding of trauma was non-existent, which meant that women who survived rape, abuse, or other violence received no support or understanding. Instead, they were often blamed for their experiences and expected to continue functioning normally despite their psychological wounds. Women who developed what we would now call PTSD were labeled as difficult, possessed, or morally corrupt. Medieval pregnancy was fraught with superstitions and restrictions that made an already dangerous process even more hazardous. Pregnant women were forbidden from looking at certain animals or people because it was believed this could mark their unborn children. They were restricted from certain foods, activities, and even thoughts because of their supposed effect on the developing fetus. These restrictions often led to malnutrition and stress that actually harmed both mother and child. The medieval belief in maternal impression held that whatever a pregnant woman saw, experienced, or thought about could physically mark her unborn child. This led to elaborate restrictions on pregnant women's activities and exposure to anything that might be considered negative or frightening. Women were essentially imprisoned in their homes during pregnancy, cut off from normal social interaction and physical activity. Medieval childbirth practices were based on superstition rather than medical knowledge. Women were forced to give birth in specific positions that were believed to be spiritually appropriate rather than medically beneficial. They were required to recite certain prayers during labor and were forbidden from expressing pain because it was considered evidence of insufficient faith. The birthing chamber was filled with religious artifacts and talismans rather than medical supplies. The high rate of infant mortality in medieval times meant that most women experienced the death of at least one child, often multiple children. The grief associated with these losses was considered excessive if it lasted too long, and women were expected to accept their children's deaths as God's will without prolonged mourning. The emotional toll of repeated pregnancy and child loss was devastating. But women received no psychological support or understanding. Medieval women who were unable to conceive children faced social ostracism and often divorce. Infertility was always blamed on the woman, never the man, regardless of the actual cause. Women underwent dangerous and painful treatments in desperate attempts to become pregnant, including consuming toxic substances, undergoing brutal physical manipulations, and submitting to various forms of folk magic that often caused more harm than good. The few women who managed to achieve positions of authority or influence faced constant challenges to their legitimacy that men in similar positions never experienced. Female rulers were accused of being too emotional, too weak, or too easily influenced by male advisors. Their successes were attributed to luck or male assistance, while their failures were blamed on their inherent female weaknesses. Medieval women in positions of power were expected to perform masculinity while still maintaining their femininity, an impossible balancing act that set them up for failure. They had to be strong enough to command respect, but not so strong that they threatened male dominance. They had to be intelligent enough to make good decisions, but not so intelligent that they appeared to be challenging the natural order. The economic dependence of medieval women made them vulnerable to exploitation at every level of society. Women who lost their husbands had few options for survival beyond remarriage, prostitution, or religious life. The legal system provided no protection for women's property rights, and widows could be easily cheated out of their inheritance by male relatives or creditors. Medieval women's participation in trade and commerce was heavily restricted by guild regulations and social expectations. Women were forbidden from most skilled trades and were relegated to low-paying, unskilled labor. Even in areas where women were traditionally dominant, like brewing or textile production, men gradually took over as these industries became more profitable and prestigious. The sexual double standard in medieval society was so extreme that it created completely different moral universes for men and women. Men's sexual activity was seen as natural and even admirable, while women's sexuality was viewed as dangerous and in need of constant control. A man who had multiple sexual partners was considered virile and successful, while a woman who did the same thing was labeled a whore and faced social destruction. Medieval prostitution was both condemned and tolerated, creating a complex system of legalized exploitation. Prostitutes were seen as necessary evils who provided an outlet for male sexuality while protecting respectable women from unwanted advances. However, prostitutes faced constant harassment, violence, and legal persecution. They were required to wear distinctive clothing, were banned from certain areas of towns, and were subjected to regular inspections and fines. The treatment of rape in medieval society reveals the complete devaluation of women's bodily autonomy. Rape was often treated as a property crime against the woman's father or husband, rather than a personal assault against the woman herself. The punishment for rape was sometimes marriage to the victim, which essentially rewarded the rapist with ownership of his victim. Women who were raped were often blamed for tempting their attackers or for failing to resist adequately. Medieval marriage laws allowed for wife selling, a practice where husbands could literally auction off their wives to other men. While not technically legal, this practice was widely tolerated and provided men with a way to dispose of unwanted wives while recouping some of the costs of marriage. Women had no say in these transactions and were expected to accept their new owners without complaint. The medieval Christian concept of marriage as a sacrament actually made women's situation worse in many ways. Because marriage was considered holy and indissoluble, women were trapped in abusive relationships with no hope of escape. Divorce was virtually impossible, and even separation required extensive legal proceedings that were heavily biased against women. The Church's emphasis on wifely obedience provided religious justification for domestic abuse. Medieval women's relationship with money and property was severely restricted by legal and social constraints. Married women couldn't own property, enter into contracts, or conduct business without their husband's permission. This economic dependence made it almost impossible for women to escape abusive relationships or to provide for themselves if their marriages ended. The concept of female inheritance was complicated by medieval laws that favored male heirs. Even when women were legally entitled to inherit property, they often faced challenges from male relatives who claimed superior rights based on their gender. Women who did inherit wealth were often forced to remarry quickly to ensure that a man would manage their assets. Medieval women's clothing served as a form of social control that reinforced their subordinate status. The elaborate dress codes for different social classes ensured that women's rank and availability were immediately visible to everyone around them. Married women were required to cover their hair, while unmarried women could display theirs. Widows wore distinctive clothing that marked them as potentially available for remarriage. Prostitutes were forced to wear identifying colors or symbols that marked them as social outcasts. The process of getting dressed in medieval times was so complex for wealthy women that it required multiple servants and could take hours to complete. This wasn't just inconvenience. It was a deliberate system designed to ensure that women couldn't function independently. A woman who couldn't dress herself without help was clearly dependent on others for her basic needs, reinforcing her status as a protected but powerless creature. Medieval footwear for women was designed to impede movement and emphasize delicacy. Wealthy women wore shoes with pointed toes so long that they had to be tied to their legs to prevent tripping. These shoes made it impossible to walk normally, and required women to take tiny, mincing steps that emphasized their helplessness. The message was clear. A properly dressed woman was a woman who couldn't run away. Yet despite all of this, medieval women found ways to survive, resist, and occasionally thrive. They formed informal networks of support, passed down knowledge through generations of women, and developed strategies for navigating the impossible circumstances of their lives. Some became powerful behind-the-scenes influences on their husbands or sons. Others found ways to accumulate wealth and property despite legal restrictions. A few even managed to break free from societal expectations entirely, becoming abbesses, mystics, or influential patrons of the arts. Medieval women developed subtle forms of resistance that allowed them to maintain some measure of autonomy within oppressive systems. They used religious devotion as a way to gain respect and protection. They formed alliances with other women that provided emotional and practical support. They found ways to influence male decision-makers through indirect means. They preserved and transmitted cultural knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. The few medieval women who achieved fame or recognition often did so by adopting masculine roles or by channeling their abilities through religious expression. Joan of Arc became a military leader by claiming divine inspiration. Hildegard of Bingen became a respected scholar by framing her knowledge as mystical visions. Christine de Pizan became a successful writer by defending women's capabilities and challenging misogynistic assumptions. Medieval women's contributions to medicine, despite being officially excluded from formal medical training, were enormous. Women served as midwives, herbalists, and healers in their communities, developing practical knowledge about health and disease that was often more effective than the theoretical medicine practiced by male physicians. This knowledge was passed down through generations of women, creating informal networks of medical expertise that were crucial for community survival. The irony is that medieval society depended entirely on women's labor while simultaneously devaluing and oppressing them. Women produced the food, textiles, and children that kept society functioning, yet received little recognition or reward for their essential contributions. They were the backbone of medieval civilization while being treated as its least important. Medieval women's resistance took many forms, from subtle defiance of social expectations to outright rebellion against oppressive systems. Some women refused to remarry after their husbands' deaths, choosing poverty over renewed subjugation. Others found ways to accumulate wealth and property despite legal restrictions. A few even challenged religious and social authorities directly, facing persecution and death for their courage. The strength and resilience of medieval women is perhaps most evident in their ability to find joy and meaning in lives that were objectively terrible by modern standards. Despite facing poverty, violence, discrimination, and early death, many medieval women managed to form loving relationships, raise children, create beautiful art and crafts, and contribute to their communities in meaningful ways. As we reach the end of this journey through medieval misery, it's worth reflecting on how these historical attitudes toward women have echoed through the centuries and continue to influence gender relations today. The medieval period established patterns of discrimination and oppression that took centuries to begin dismantling, and many societies around the world still struggle with the legacy of these ancient prejudices. The legal principle that women were property rather than people persisted in many Western countries well into the modern era. Married women couldn't own property, enter into contracts, or vote in many places until the late 19th or early 20th centuries. The idea that women were mentally and physically inferior to men was used to justify educational and professional discrimination. That continued well into the modern era. The medical misconceptions about women's bodies that originated in medieval times influenced medical practice for centuries afterward. The belief that women were naturally hysterical and emotionally unstable was used to justify excluding them from education and professional opportunities. The medicalization of pregnancy and childbirth, while ultimately beneficial, was also used to reinforce ideas about women's inherent weakness and need for male protection. The sexual double standards that were so prominent in medieval society continue to influence attitudes toward women's sexuality today. The idea that women who are sexually active are somehow damaged or less valuable persists in many cultures. The notion that women are responsible for controlling male sexuality through their behavior and dress continues to influence everything, from school dress codes to legal responses to sexual assault. The next time you complain about modern life, remember the medieval woman who woke up before dawn to bake bread that might kill her family, who gave birth without pain relief, while being told her agony was divine punishment, who worked like a slave while being treated like property, and who faced death for expressing opinions or challenging authority. Remember that the right to vote, own property, get an education, choose your partner, and control your own body, rights that many of us take for granted, were literally unthinkable luxuries for medieval women. Their stories remind us that progress is not inevitable, that rights can be lost as easily as they're gained, and that the fight for equality is ongoing. Medieval women's lives were nightmares by our standards, but they laid the groundwork for every advancement that followed. Their suffering, resistance, and resilience in the face of impossible odds deserve to be remembered, not just as historical curiosities, but as testament to the strength of the human spirit and the vital importance of continuing to fight for justice and equality. The medieval period teaches us that societies can function for centuries while systematically oppressing half their population, but that such oppression comes at an enormous cost in human potential and happiness. The contributions that medieval women might have made to art, science, literature, and politics, if they had been given equal opportunities, are lost to history forever. So tonight, as you go to sleep in your comfortable bed with your legal rights intact and your future full of possibilities, spare a thought for the countless medieval women who never had those luxuries, but whose struggles made your freedom possible. And maybe, just maybe, their stories will inspire you to use your privileges to make the world a little bit better for the women who come after you, because that's what they would have wanted. Not pity for their suffering, but determination to ensure that such nightmares never happen again. The medieval woman who died in childbirth at 15, who was burned as a witch for having opinions, who was beaten for speaking out of turn, who lived her entire life as someone else's property, she would want us to remember that freedom is precious, that equality is worth fighting for, and that the arc of history only bends toward justice when people are willing to grab it and pull.